Welcome back to GBN America, where I'm delighted to be in conversation this afternoon with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Colonel, thank you for joining me. This is a really exciting and interesting time for American foreign policy, and one that other countries are a bit nervous about. So what do you think the major changes will be with a Trump administration?
Well, I think you can't start anywhere else except for Ukraine, because that's going to be one of the biggest differences, even during the campaign between Harris and Trump, in what their vision was. When you looked at, say, for example, the Middle East with Israel or so, there was nuanced difference. They were pretty much along the same lines. But when you look at the Ukraine policies, it couldn't be any more different between night and day. Harris was basically going to look at the perpetuation of the status quo with what they'd been doing, and Trump has a very starkly different view. Literally just before we came on the air here, I got off the phone with one of Trump's senior advisors in his campaign and asked him what is his updated view. We've seen what he said in public. And this advisor told me that straight out of Trump's mouth is that he believes that this situation is in a stalemate, that the war cannot be won, that it doesn't matter how much ammunition, weapons, or anything else the West would provide, it can't be won. And given that fact, then he said the only thing that makes sense is to seek an end to the war. And in his vision, the way he would see that happening is that the first thing he would do is to try to get the fighting stopped, get an armistice of sorts or a ceasefire. And then he said he recognizes it's going to take a long time to have negotiations. But he said the most important thing is to preserve for the Ukrainian side the ability to get into the European Union with whatever is left. He didn't go into specifics about whether that would involve ceding territory, but I can't imagine any negotiation settlement not doing that. But his primary concern is that he wants to stop the killing of the Ukrainian people and preserve their path, especially to the European Union.
And the point you make is that it can't be won, and the war doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But although it can't be won, can it be lost? That is to say, Putin is the aggressor. He invaded sovereign territory. And what sort of a lesson does that give to the Chinese and other not necessarily friendly nations if a dictator can invade and ultimately win, ultimately be effectively appeased? Isn't that something we should be worried about?
Well, to your first point, 100%, it can still be lost. And that's one of the things I've been arguing from a military perspective, really from the outset, that the capacity for the Ukraine side and all of its Western supporters and the Russian side and all of its foreign supporters is just not in balance. It is overwhelmingly in the Russian side. So if we continue on trying to say we want this outcome, which is what the U.S. administration has done for the past 4 years, then you're setting up the Ukraine side for an outcome that's bad because it can't win, but it can lose. Now, you talk about the implications that can have otherwise. I would argue that it's not simply that he's an aggressor, so we can't reward that. We have to look at why this happened in the beginning. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves and say that the push into NATO into Ukraine was a factor in that, because Russia, in their view, and you have to look at it from just their view, even if you disagree with it, was it a foreign military alliance on their border in that area. And that's different than, like, say, the Baltics. Militarily, it's different. It's much more vulnerable for the Russian side. And that we have Jens Stoltenberg admitted in December of 2023 that Putin told him that if NATO was off the table, then he wouldn't have invaded. But if it stayed on the table, he was going to. That's Stoltenberg's view. So we have to also be sober-minded and saying, hey, we have to not do things that unnecessarily provoke an adversary while defending our own rights and not giving a veto to anybody else. But we have to do things that make sense. And I think that the history will show that a lot of the things we didn't make sense and unnecessarily provoked.
Well, I certainly agree with you that a number of mistakes were made, not least the Minsk agreement in 2014 that allowed Putin to get away with his first act of aggression. And also, if one were to criticize the Biden administration, that everything they did to support Ukraine came a bit late, and therefore every weapon system was a few months after it was going to have maximum effect. I wonder whether there isn't more of an option to deliver things to the Ukrainians quickly so that they're in a stronger position and allow them to fire their missiles into Russia, which obviously Russia has been doing in reverse, to give them an opportunity to maximize their military effectiveness.
Well, it's frankly too late for that now, for the long range weapons. Even if we had them, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has publicly admitted we don't, and he said he added also the French and the British also don't have enough to have a sustained campaign, because a few missile launches is not going to make any difference. It has to be a sustained campaign, and that's only on the tactical element of whether it would or wouldn't be effective. And as you pointed out, the Russians have been doing this sustained campaign, and you see it has a damaging effect, but not a decisive effect. And the war has been going on for closing in on 3 years now. But there's a big difference in the way that we would have done it, because Russia has nuclear weapons, whereas Ukraine doesn't. So if you start this long-range campaign into Russia, I mean, they've been pretty unequivocal if they would consider that the direct involvement of the West, and then it could go into nuclear weapons. So we don't have to like what Putin was saying, but we do have to respect the possibility that further aggressive action could actually spawn the very escalation of the war that we say we don't want. And again, we have to deal with the reality that we have and not the outcome that we would prefer.
And the point you make about nuclear weapons is an absolute crucial one. And of course, Ukraine had nuclear weapons, but gave them up, and gave them up with a guarantee from the US, the UK, and Russia that they would be able to maintain their territorial integrity. So the lesson here for states is that if you've got nuclear weapons, don't give them up and try and get them, isn't it? That for long-term global security, the success of Russia in taking land from Ukraine, if that's the ultimate settlement, is a lesson to other aggressors, and indeed other countries that may need to defend themselves. Don't rely on guarantees, rely on brute force.
Well, but I would also argue that we also have to be careful that for the aggressor side to say, hey, it's not an easy call. It's not like, yeah, we're going to do this, because how massive of a price has Russia paid for this? That just shows how deeply they felt the threat was to them, that they were willing to sacrifice scores of thousands. Who knows what the actual number is, but it's huge. According to sources I've touched to in Russia, that the claim that it's like 600,000 or so dead is an exaggeration, but the real number apparently is very, very high, more than the U.S. suffered in Vietnam and Korea, from what I've been told. But so that's not an easy call to make, and then you still have the problem of, even once this fighting is ended for the Russian side, now they're still going to have to maintain a hostile border no matter where it ends up, and that's not something they're going to want to do. So that's going to be a drain on their economy long term. So I think when you look at the net, that there's not an easy call for a so-called future aggressor, and most people point to China and Taiwan. And frankly, that decision will be made based on the conditions in the Indo-Pacific almost exclusively, and not what did or didn't happen here, because the conditions are so different.
And that was the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because you made a very important point, which I'm sure is right for all political and diplomatic decision-making. You need to think about it in the way your opponent is thinking about it. We know what Communist China thinks of Taiwan, the Republic of China. It thinks it's a rebel province and is part of China. How would America respond if China became more aggressive towards Taiwan?
Well, now a lot of that's going to depend on what the new administration is, what the past administration has said, and it's been pretty famous out there that on 3 separate occasions President Biden said we would defend Taiwan. He later walked it back, but the fact that he said it 2 additional times after it had walked back left that very much open in question. And many are in the United States are advocating, getting rid of strategic ambiguity for strategic clarity, and saying we should defend Taiwan. But I'm just telling you, from a military perspective, that would be nearly suicidal for us, because China has all the advantages in its backyard. Now, if you talk about even spreading into the Indo-Pacific and much less anywhere else, all the advantages come to us. So if we fought China on their terms in their turf, I think it's very likely that we would suffer a military loss. So it would be foolish to the highest order to fight a battle that you can't win, and may end up not even stopping China, because the idea that they're going to suffer losses and then stop fighting for Taiwan, I think is unrealistic in the extreme. So what we should do is help Taiwan defend itself, but be frank about where their limits of the support are, because then that should influence what the Taiwanese people do in terms of their negotiations and diplomacy with China, because ultimately they're responsible for their security and they've got to make decisions. But I think we have to be clear about what we would and wouldn't do.
And in those terms, what do you think you should do in terms of supplying Taiwan with weapons and with weapon systems? Because obviously they've been a very important partner with the United States, and a lot of their weaponry does come from America.
Well, I think that the primary thing we should to a much higher extent escalate diplomacy and to try to work both with China and Taiwan and other countries in the region, and to say, hey, look, the last thing that any of us want, and I mean any of us, to include China, is a conflict and a war, because that would devastate everybody's economy and every single one of them would lose, to include us, Japan, obviously Taiwan. So I think that we should put a lot more effort internationally in doing that. And look, China hasn't done anything since 1949. So it's not like they're on the cusp of, they just are just chomping at the bit to have an attack. They want to settle this non-military means, or they would just like it to continue on the status quo, as long as it's not moving in the direction of independence for Taiwan. So as long as we can maintain that and show that we're not a threat to go to war with China, there's every reason to believe that that can still go on and everyone can still benefit economically in the region. And that should be the primary objective.
So if the primary objective is economic, and that's been something that actually has made China much richer in the last 30 years and indeed helped the US economy, are tariffs going to be a good way of improving relations with China, or does that just become an appearance of hostility, of diplomatic unfriendliness?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. There's no easy call on that, because you don't want to say, nope, we're not going to use any tariffs and we'll just go, because then China is very famous or infamous for using manipulative terms and doing things, and stealing intellectual property, et cetera. And those things have to be countered, but there are mechanisms to do that. We just have to be real careful about not making the lazy use of tariffs and thinking that's going to fix a problem, because historically what we've seen is that just shifts the problem elsewhere, and China will find a workaround, and then it gets a tit for tat kind of situation, which then comes back to bite us in certain areas too. So it's a double-edged sword that has to be wielded very, very carefully.
And to move on, you said that policy in the Middle East will remain similar. But Donald Trump was very successful in the Middle East. First of all, he pulled out of the terrible agreement with Iran, which I'm sorry to say the UK government thought was a good idea. He didn't give $6 billion to Iran, as Biden did just before the attacks of the 7th of October last year. The Abraham Accords were working. Trump was doing really well in the Middle East in his last period in office.
Well, he certainly did in many of those areas, although I would dispute that the getting out of the JCPOA was good, because if you look at the years before that, like say the 2 or 3 years before that, in terms of what Iran had, what its capabilities were, and what has happened every bit since 2018 has been decidedly negative for our side, because we took out the leverage that we had. So I would argue that was a bad decision, and probably that's too late to put that genie back in the bottle. But the driving imperative has got to be to prevent the region from blowing out into region-wide war, because that would be bad for Israel, it would be bad for the United States, it would be bad for every country over there, and wouldn't help anything. And let me be clear on one thing: this idea that Iran can be defeated militarily without a ground invasion is one of the more dangerous thoughts out there, because obviously Israel has been talking a lot about maybe taking out their leadership, taking out their nuclear infrastructure or oil infrastructure, et cetera, and all that will do is explode the thing. Because look, Iran is 4 times larger, or 4 or 5 times larger than Iraq was geographically, and the only way that you can defeat militarily countries if you invade it and take it over. But if you just use a bunch of missiles, you'll kill a bunch of people and blow a bunch of stuff up. But ultimately, you can't wipe out an entire country. So now then you've had perpetual open-ended war, and then they're going to strike back in ways that hurt our interests very much and could cripple us. And in terms of the global economy, if the Strait of Hormuz, for example, got shut down. So there's everything bad from that going into a conflict. And what I hope Trump does is to keep a lid on things and to keep anything from escalating.
And do you think that's what he'll do? Because sometimes his rhetoric towards Iran has been indicative that he might actually like to go to war with them. I know he had no wars in his previous term of office, But he made some quite aggressive noises about Iran, particularly.
He did, but I think that his general and across the board inclination is to avoid wars, because he ran in 2016 on a lot of the dumb wars in Iraq and elsewhere, and then when he had the chance, didn't take things further in certain areas, and I hope that pervades into the next term. And look at what he did with the assassination of Soleimani, the Iranian general. On his terms. Now, that was a very provocative move, and I argued at the time I didn't think that was a good move, that it didn't help anybody, but it put things to the boiling point. Iran retaliated eventually with 100 ballistic missiles on a U.S. base in Iraq, but they did it, according to everybody I've talked to, with the knowledge that basically was telling the U.S. where it was going to attack so that they could keep the casualties low or non-existent, which is ultimately what happened. We had some wounded, quite a few, but nobody was killed from it. And you see that Trump did not take the next step and escalate beyond that. So he said, all right, that was a tit for tat. We're going to call it even and let it go. Many people were saying that because of this attack on American base, we should strike even harder, and he refused to do that. So I hope that that is an indication of where he would go, and that he wants to be rhetorically harsh against Iran, but he doesn't want to get the U.S. sucked into a war it can't win.
This seems to be slightly the reverse of Teddy Roosevelt, who is one of my particular heroes as an American president. It's not speak softly and carry a big stick. It's shout as loudly as you can, but try and keep your stick hidden.
Well, partially I agree with that. It is, you shout a lot, and that's unfortunately across the board. It seems to be one of the popular things in American leadership these days, which I'm not a big fan of. But you got to use the stick in ways that can help you out. And I argue that stick in terms of military power should only be wielded if our national security is either threatened or we've been attacked, not because we want a certain outcome. I think that is a disastrous, catastrophic way to use military force. It never succeeds. It doesn't help anything, and it just creates all these troubles for you. So I think that a lot less use of a stick is something that would help. But make sure that your stick is powerful. So if it does need to be used, if we are attacked, we're about to be attacked, we have to have a very credible stick. And that's one of the other things that Trump is going to need to do, because our military is not anywhere near as strong as a lot of people think it is. So that's another reason not to drag it into war.
And to end really where we began back with Ukraine, does Putin just have to hold steady and recognize that if Ukraine isn't getting US support anymore, he can essentially run down the clock, and by the middle of next year, he will have won? What will Trump do to try and force the pace to get peace negotiations going?
Well, see, I would argue the situation is somewhat different than that. I would say that Putin hasn't been paying any attention to who is or might be the U.S. president. He has been on a methodical move this entire calendar year. In fact, you can actually start it back in November of last year. It is a nonstop, methodical move forward where they are winning on the battlefield. And the New York Times had a piece out just a couple of weeks ago that showed graphically what that looks like from November 2022 all the way to the forward. And you see the last 6 or so months are just going straight up in terms of how much territory they've been taken back and how many Ukrainian soldiers are being killed in those operations, and it is absolutely unsustainable. If Putin wants to, he can forget about negotiations, not talk about anything, and he can just continue grinding on and maybe outright win a military victory next year, which is why I argue it is actually in Ukraine's interest, definitely with the United States and Europe, to seek a negotiated settlement that preserves a viable Ukraine state. Because if we don't, then I think that there may not be a viable Ukraine state, and Putin may get to a point where he issues surrender terms. And I think that is a real possibility that, a lot of people don't want to contemplate, but you look at the evidence on the ground, and I think that is a more probability than it gets into a stalemate.
All right. Well, Colonel, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with the viewers of GBN America. I found it absolutely invaluable listening to you, so thank you very much indeed.
Indeed, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.